A company called Skeleton Concept, based in Paris, was just ordered to pay Rolex over 1 million euros after it was found to have engaged in unfair competition. In this video, we'll discuss what happened, why the court ruled in favor of Rolex, and why this case is significant. And if you like, stay tuned until the end of the video when we will look at some lessons from this case. The facts are these Rolex sells luxury watches. No surprise there. In 2014, Rolex sent a cease and desist letter to a Paris-based custom atelier called Skeletonized Concept. This followed Rolex becoming aware of Skeleton Concept. Practice of drastically skeletonizing their watches and then selling them as unique pieces under the name Concept. So, what does that mean? Drastically, well, as one might guess, many mechanical watches, including those made by Rolex, can be modified by watchmakers or ateliers to varying degrees. Some modifications, according to the court, are quite common and do not alter the watch's appearance, functionality, or value much. Others can be more invasive, removing certain parts or changing the way they operate to allow new functions or aesthetics. Here, according to the court's Skeleton Concept, went about this in an extreme way. Their process included opening up Rolex watches, removing bridges and other internal components, re-engraving the hour markers, crown, logos, writing on the dials, etc. They would drill into the dials. They would remove the original case back, often replacing it with a display case back so that one could see inside. They would also remove the winding rotor, rendering the watch unable to wind automatically, requiring instead manual winding, and they would also replace the winding crown with a different one. Now, this may seem like a simple aesthetic modification, but the court says it had a real impact on the watch's function. The court said that Skeleton Concept's approach to skeletonizing watches was very aggressive and served to fundamentally alter the brand, the model, and the initial function of the timepiece. So, here's where things get interesting. After Rolex sent its cease and desist letter, Skeleton Concept decided to double down. It kept selling the modified watches and started to promote them online using various hashtags, including hashtag Rolex, hashtag Rolex Day Date, hashtag Day Date 40, and others. And they did this while making sure that their own branding was also clear, that being V, but the court ruled that the average consumer was unlikely to make that distinction. Rolex brought a lawsuit against Skeleton Concept before the Paris Judicial Court, and in February 2025, the court issued its decision. What was the court's decision? And what did they say? Was this a case of trademark exhaustion? Rolex argued that the drastic modifications rendered the watches substantially different from their original form, and therefore, the use of Rolex trademarks was not covered by the exhaustion doctrine. Exhaustion is a legal principle which provides that once goods have been placed on the market by the trademark owner, the owner loses control over the use of their trademark on those goods. That means that third parties are allowed to resell those goods even if they are resold for uses or purposes that the trademark owner did not intend. For example, let's say Zara sells a t-shirt with one of my favorite bands on it. Maybe they didn't get the band's permission. The band might complain to Zara, but ultimately the band likely would unsucceed because Zara's use of the band's trademark was likely seen as a fair use, given that the band's logo had already been put on the market. So that's exhaustion. But the court here found that because the changes to the watch were so drastic, this was not a case of exhaustion. The court stated that merely adding a new component to a product, whether it's clothing or accessories or something else, cannot result in the modification of the product's identity. However, in this case, the court said that the identity of the product was in fact modified. The court stated that the identity of a product can be modified, in particular when the modifications go beyond mere aesthetic changes and actually change the product. Use, its appearance, its functioning, and its overall impression to the point where the modified product appears significantly different to the consumer than the product with the registered trade. The court then gave a number of examples of how this kind of modification can take place. And I think this language is quite broad. It isn't limited only to luxury watches. The court said that in this case, the modified timepieces no longer evokes the same image as the original products. and thus the court rejected the argument that the use of the Rolex marks was exhausted. But it wasn't just exhaustion. Rolex also argued that the use of its marks by skeleton concept was not only unauthorized, it was also misleading. How was it misleading? Well, the court said that by continuing to use the hashtags and logos, skeleton concept led consumers to believe that the watches had been modified by Rolex itself. The court also found that the use of the Swiss-made indication was misleading. The court explained that although the watches were originally Swiss-made, after the substantial modifications carried out in France, this indication became inaccurate and therefore constituted an act of unfair competition. What did the court order? So, after finding that skeleton concept infringed on Rolex's trademark rights, and now for some takeaways. First, this case highlights the importance of monitoring third-party use of your marks, especially when that use may fall outside of trademark exhaustion. A lot of brands do UN to monitor for this type of use, because they might think that the third-party use is actually covered by exhaustion. But this is clearly not always the case. This case also shows that courts are generally going to be flexible with the concept of what it means to modify the character or the identity of a product. The court here said that it was not only the fact that the product was modified, but also the way that it was modified that needed to be taken into account. If the modifications are superficial, then exhaustion should apply. But if they go deeper and in some way change the identity of the product, then they shouldn't. Third, this case is another example of a court awarding damages for injury to the brand's reputation. Courts seem increasingly willing to award damages like this, meaning that it is all the more important for brands to protect their reputations. And finally, the Swiss-made part of this decision seems particularly relevant for brands who use geographic indications as part of their marketing. Although we're not seeing a ton of cases on this, yet this is a warning sign that if you make significant changes to a product in a place that you highlight in your marketing, that may constitute a false or misleading statement and expose you to liability. This is obviously a very interesting area to continue to monitor. If you want us to cover any of these issues in more depth, please let us know. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please remember to share and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.